Hello, welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Before we start, I'm excited to share that we're hosting Rust Asia Conference 2025 on March 28th in Hong Kong. This is your chance to dive into the world of Rust in Asia and beyond. We've already got Tim McNamara, the author of Rust in Action, as our keynote speaker, and more speakers will be announced soon. Check out all the details at www.rustasiaconf.com. Now back to the episode. Today we have Matthias Endler. Matthias is the host of the Rust in Production podcast and a Rust consultant at Corrode.dev. We were talking for, has it been over a year? For sure, over a year. Like over LinkedIn,
Probably.
we keep dropping messages every couple of months. In any case, yeah, we're kind of here to basically to cover a couple of topics, mostly overall just to kind of catch up, because I was told that you're somebody definitely get to know. And you wrote this interesting project called Lychee.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce it? You pronounce it a different way.
I pronounce it Lychee, but it's probably wrong.
Lychee. Yeah. It's a link checker, right? But let's just be more specific. It's a HTTP focused URL checker, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it focuses on web links and it supports all of the different data formats that you might have: HTML, Markdown, ASCII doc, plain text, whatsoever. It extracts links from these documents and then it checks them. Simple as that. Sounds like a weekend project. I've been on it for a couple of years now.
I have a couple of questions about the protocol, right? Because, I mean, obviously HTTP, HTTPS, is there any other protocols or just those two?
Those are the two that we support right now. Supporting other things is very complicated. We also support email if you want to count that in. But for example, if you look at other projects or other protocols like FTP or Slack channels or whatever, then the question is, what does it mean for a link to be alive? Because a lot of these things are behind logins and paywalls, and some of those protocols might not be well supported or specified, and this is where it gets a little hairy. So we focus on HTTP and HTTPS mostly.
The reason I'm asking is because I'm just thinking, like with the web browser, most of them, I'm not sure if they still support, most likely they do. Like I remember clicking on like FTP links within the browser and you can download stuff, probably also upload. I don't know, it depends on the FTP link. But yeah, of course, some of them do ask you to log in, etc. So you're just focusing on those two protocols.
Yes, and people ask us about supporting other protocols all the time, and that's not an issue. We can totally do that as long as there's a crate for it. Essentially, what Lychee or Lychee does, depending on where you live, it is a conglomerate of different libraries that we put together into a CLI library. So we stand on the shoulders of giants. We use Common, Mark, we use HTML5 Ever, we use a lot of other crates, we use Linkify just to extract those links. And I think it's the same for protocols, right? How you even fetch a website. Do you fetch the plain text version through request, or do you have a browser engine behind it? These are interesting questions that you need to answer.
Most of the information I have at the moment was from one of your videos that you sent to me, which is you presented. I'm just going to call it Lychee. And that's always the question too: is how do you justify a link is a proper link? Is it the structure? Does it need to have all the different pieces? Is it that your browser should actually just go to it? But then the question is, what does your browser actually do? Because maybe your browser doesn't actually support going to that web address using that exact format, because you're just saying, okay, like for instance, you had this one AI and you specifically said, okay, type AI in your browser, it works. If it doesn't, try AI / and it's going to work, right? You don't have HTTP, you don't have HTTPS, you don't have www, you don't have all these other things that people try to say that's part of a link, yet that works. So like that's the question is, how many browsers would actually just support just typing AI / or just AI? I don't know.
When people talk about links, they have an implicit understanding of what a link is. A link for a lot of users is just what a browser understands. So if a browser can resolve it, it's probably a link. But if you build a tool that needs to sort of statically analyze whether a string is a link or not, you can run into all sorts of edge cases. The one that you mentioned is a very specific case where you can register a website, you can host a website on a TLD. And there's a TLD called AI, and that happens actually AR, in fact, that's for the Arabic TLD. And that hosts a website. So you can resolve it with your browser. I think AI actually was another case. I can't remember which others were valid, but that has to come from the registrar. So the person owning the TLD, the organization owning these. And that's very uncommon, but it makes parsing these links extremely hard. Essentially, the only thing you really need is a string, and everything could literally be a link. Even text like example could be a valid link if that is a valid TLD, for example, or if it's in your etc hosts. What we usually refer to as links has some sort of format. For example, it has a schema, HTTP or HTTPS, and then it has a domain name followed by a dot and a TLD.
But what about adding in, say, a port?
Exactly. Ports are supported, of course. Essentially, there's a package for URLs. It's the URL crate that server also uses under the hood. And they do a lot of the heavy lifting. You can check if it is a link by just running it through their URL parser. The other thing that works in our favor is Linkify, which is a really nice tool that extracts links from plain text. We use that very heavily when we're unsure. And the way they work is they built a state machine for it. Now, it's not a regular expression because building a regular expression for URLs is very hard. Instead, they have a state machine where they go through a given text and they stop at a point where they are pretty certain that a string is not a URL. And if they go through all the way, then it most likely is a URL. And in practice, that works surprisingly well. The test base is pretty high, so they cover a lot of cases, lots of edge cases.
The question is this a link or is this a valid link? It's more than just does it have all these things? Does your browser try to use it? I think you even go further than saying, does this thing actually point to something? Right? Because you mentioned this the example of is it DOI? Is that what it's called?
Yes, a DOI link. And for explanation, a DOI link is a research link, and there's an entire standard behind it. You can register your own server to be a host of DOI links, and these links typically get added to research papers and books because the promise is that they never break. Of course, they do break when a server goes down or when an organization maybe misconfigured their server, and that happens all the time. You run into various edge cases. And then the only way to fix it is to tell this organization running the server that their setup is incorrect. So there's a person who does just that because they found a couple of issues with some of these DOI servers through Lychee, and they reached out to the organizers, to the organizations, and surprisingly, a few of them fixed their setup, which is always a nice success. I guess on a deeper level, the question is what makes for a valid link? What is it that we define as valid? Oh, for example, a lot of people would define it as an OK status 200. This is when you get a valid response and there's an HTML body maybe, and yeah, the body ends at some point and the status code is 200. So I think that's the easiest way to check if a link is valid. But there are other 2XX codes which might also be valid. For example, there's a 206 code, which means we received your request, we accept it, but there's no response body. And that is also fine. Now, for example, LinkedIn sends you a 999 if you try to crawl them or if you try to check a link. And that is because they don't want to be crawled. They have bot detection and they chose an invalid status code. So that can crash some of the libraries that you use. There are so many edge cases out there, and the bigger players are usually the worst because platforms like X.com or YouTube, they have very, let's say, non-standard ways of dealing with link checkers.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It seems like anybody can be crawled because I often see my websites getting crawled because I can see like every URL that gets hit, and they always do like slash dot get slash .env trying to pull like configuration files or code files and things like that. Like, all right, good, good job, good try. I guess it works in some cases because otherwise they wouldn't be trying this and always trying those specific files, right? So it seems like basically almost every single website out there will be crawled no matter what because my websites are definitely not that popular in comparison to say Google or GitHub.
Yes, I would like to note that we don't crawl. I guess those words are used interchangeably, but what we do is just checking if a link is valid. We don't really crawl in a sense that we store the content somewhere. We discard the content and the body. We don't even load the body most of the time. We just check the headers if possible. And I think we try to be good citizens of the web. At the moment, we check a couple million links per week, all through GitHub. And these are just the projects that I know of. The project is currently integrated in a couple thousand GitHub repos to check documentation and mostly markdown files and public documentation. So these are use cases that people themselves come up with to check their own code base and to check their own documentation. And I think that's fine. What we don't do is guessing which links exist because that's sort of a gray area. You can, of course, point it to a sitemap and check all the links in the sitemap, but you have to do so explicitly. Lychee is a tool that if you let it run, it will certainly max out your network card. The limiting factor will be your bandwidth, and some servers cannot handle the number of requests, so you need to be careful and apply rate limiting, for example.
So you literally have to feed it a list of links for it to check, and it's going to go through and check all those links.
Yes. You can also use it to dump all the links on a page, which is sometimes very helpful. For example, you want to check which other links or which other websites you point to, and you can get a quick overview by saying lychee minus minus dump, and then you give it a URL, and it will print out all the links that it found. You can even pipe that output to another CLI tool of your choice, and some people do that. Another case that I personally haven't thought of, which seems to be very popular, is when people migrate their websites. Say you have your old host and you want to migrate to a new host. What do? You can check all of those links manually, or you use Lychee to rewrite the URL because we have a remap feature which allows you to apply a regex to incoming links. So remapping them to another link and checking if that link is valid. And people use that to migrate websites. They only switch off the old one when a new one resolves all the links perfectly.
I remember doing this for another company where they had like a whole process about how it's all done. And yeah, checking the links is quite, it's one of the steps I never really thought about before, but definitely something you need to think about.
I'm curious, how did you do it? Which tool did you use for that?
This is like over 10 years ago. I'm just trying to remember what the heck we did. I think you can tell Google like to recrawl your website or something like that. And then in general, like I think we did redirects. I think to something in like the router of the site. So if we decided to change the URL, we would just do like a redirect. I think you just do that for like a couple of months or something and then turn it off because most people just kind of follow it.
Right, Google Analytics works well, but the turnaround time is extremely high. Sometimes it can be days or weeks between a recrawl. And if you want to iterate fast, I think you want some sort of automation around that. So I think Lychee serves purpose there, and there are some nice applications for companies, I'd say. I do believe that the core of it should be open source, but I can see a number of commercial tools you could build on top of Lychee if you wanted to. For example, one tool that I personally liked, which was built by Thomas from Switzerland, was an integration to Confluence, because a lot of knowledge, a lot of data is in Confluence, and he built a plugin that uses Lychee in the background to check those Confluence pages. And I think this is a really nice success story of the project itself. Thomas has since become a core contributor.
Okay. But let's kind of roll back a little bit more because people don't just wake up one day and say, I think I'm going to make a link checker because I don't know. Why not? I mean, something had to happen that this came up on your radar, no?
Yes, in 2015, I started a list of linters and static analysis tools. And I didn't think much of it. I put it on GitHub, and it started as a simple README file with a lot of URLs to various tools that I needed. And it was one of these awesome lists, if you know those. And the list kept growing. Eventually, I had 700 tools on the page, and people kept nagging me about broken links. And I wanted something that would never break. I wanted something that would always show you valid links or throw out, outdated tools or deprecated tools. And so I thought, how hard could it be? During COVID times, I had some time on my hand, and I needed some material for my YouTube channel anyway, which is now defunct. It was called Hello Rust. And I just recorded me building the first version of it. The video is still online. And in fact, it was a very quick process. It only took a day to get the first version running. But then, of course, you look at your competition, I guess, on GitHub, and you see what other features they have, and you want to make the most complete link checker possible. And add to that a couple years of user requests, and you end up with a pretty extensive set of functionality. But it started very humble.
What would you call that? Like a snowball going into like an avalanche kind of situation, to where how things kind of happen.
Yeah. I like these projects because you fix your own problems and you scratch your own itch. And it turns out it was a real problem for other people as well. And also for large organizations, of which I thought they had in house solutions for this, but turns out they didn't. For example, OpenSearch, the project by AWS, uses it. Google uses it for some of their internal documentation and also on GitHub. Microsoft uses it. And all of these companies somehow found value in it.
That's pretty interesting. Yeah, you'd figure some places would have some kind of tool or something, but and I worked in a large company before. I worked in Motorola back before it was even. Now it's it's two different companies now, but it was one large company when I first got there. And it's crazy, like the amount of stuff that people have to build themselves because they can't get the funding, or they can't, usually they can't get the funding for it, for buying a tool or whatever. It's just a pain. I don't know why, but it seems like the larger organization you are, the less money you actually get to get things that you need, which doesn't really make a lot of sense in people's minds.
My working theory is that they would love to contribute. It's just that it incurs a lot of organizational overhead to do so. You have to go through 3 layers of approval, and that takes you 6 months or 1 year to pass. And at the end of the day, the little funding that they provide to open source projects is nothing in comparison to the hours and the salaries that they need to put into starting such a project or such a program. I would like to plug Trivago for a second because I did work at Trivago in the past, and at some point we were the fourth biggest open source sponsor. We sponsored almost as much as Facebook back in the day, now Meta, and we were a much smaller organization. I guess it's doable. It's just not done, or there's no process behind it. There's no specific role for it. You always need to find a business case to convince any organization to sponsor you. And I think open source tools are ill equipped to talk their language. It's sometimes not even possible to explain to them why you need funding or what's the real benefit they get out of you. It's just that when you walk away or when you give up maintenance, this will be felt in such organizations.
Sean talked about this in an article and also a little bit on the podcast when we had there when I interviewed him last time. Sean MacArthur from Hyper. There is this kind of problem, like you said, where if you can't get the funding, right, you just can't work on it anymore, and people start to realize, hey, we really need to do something. I think he mentioned something like he was calling up a couple of people that he obviously knows are using it because usually they're submitting bugs or whatever. I don't remember exactly what he says, but from what I remember, and I may be wrong, is something like, hey, if something doesn't happen, I may not be able to keep working on this. What kind of use are you guys getting on this because of blah blah blah? And then I think that rattled a couple of chains, or at least it helped the business case of why they should have support, or why they should have to support this project. Which it's, I mean, are you doing the same?
I'm reaching out, but mostly in form of an email, and usually I'm in contact with these companies anyway. So talking to them about sponsoring is easier than if you already established some form of communication before. And I think the way to get those bigger clients on board is by talking about supply chain safety, because they understand that this is a risk and the risk is a potential cost for them. And so they want to avoid costs at all means. And so this way, I guess you can talk to them on a different level. You say, okay, did you know that out of the 1,000 open source tools that you use, 100 of them will go out of business or will be deprecated in the next 6 months? Is that a huge problem for you? How much time does it take you to replace these tools? And what are the hours? So, this is something they understand. That's a language they understand. And I guess this would probably be one way I would try to find for any open source tool. Maybe there's a way to talk about supply chain safety. I think in general, this is something that the Rust community as a whole needs to think about now that everyone is moving their applications to production, where you have a lot of dependencies, but you are not sure about the health of these dependencies that you use on a daily basis. And also other communities don't do a good job in fixing this. I don't know of any such tool for any community really, but I think it should exist.
That's kind of a hot topic these days. Is I think about the supply chain more, and you're talking more on the financial, if this thing's not going to be around kind of style. Where I think people are also talking about like, is this thing actually safe to use? Right, the whole thing, the X is it XZ or XE bug with SSH. That's one thing, but these all these open source projects that people basically depend upon are just kind of done by people in their spare time or maybe full time. I don't know, and it's crazy how easily some of these projects can actually get something in there and then they don't get discovered until it's too late. That's a whole nother topic that a lot of companies are talking about. Are you also bringing up that topic too?
Totally. And a lot of companies, for example, are looking at SBOM files right now, the software bill of materials, and how their software gets built and what are the individual parts of it. I think it's kind of logical to have such a file. Imagine you're a car manufacturer and you don't know who your suppliers are and which materials they use and where they source it from. That would be ridiculous. But in software, since it's not that regulated, apparently you can still pass by and you don't have to go through such strict checks right now or certifications for it. But there are certainly areas where certification plays a bigger role, for example, in automotive. And for these customers, it's more and more relevant to have tools that support them in the Rust ecosystem. Lychee is just a very simple and basic example for this, but there are much more important dependencies like Tokyo, for example, or Surdy, which are probably in every business application running with Rust nowadays. Um, if you take these away, that would be a huge issue for the entire community. Just try to move people away from Surdy. That's going to be very hard.
But there's still some people who are trying to gun for that position of a Serde replacement. But I don't think you can beat it at this point. It's like Tokyo. It's just so well into the community that everybody uses it and everybody knows it.
I think that the Rust Foundation, to some extent, needs to survey or triage some of the packages that are relevant to the Rust community as a whole and reach out to these maintainers to see how to increase the bus factor and how to reduce risk here. That would probably be something that would increase the level of confidence from commercial vendors and commercial users of Rust.
But so you increase the bus factor, but how are you going to increase the bus factor is the question.
I guess first you need to establish whether there's an issue with the bus factor. It might be that a project is already well maintained, well funded, more than one person has access to the package on Crates.io and can make releases, and there's proper documentation. All of these things that right now you have to check manually, I guess, for every single dependency. For the ones where you identify that there's an issue with the bus vector, I guess fixing that will be hard. You can always reach out to the maintainers and see if you can help out in some sort. But if they don't want any help, then at least you are aware that there's a risk. So you can plan ahead and see if there's potentially an alternative, potentially a way to protect some of the critical dependencies in the ecosystem, and to see if there are ways to mitigate the risk a little bit. Maybe by maintaining a fork, or just having a copy of that lying around that you can switch over to. Something that is a bit more sanctioned than just any random crate out there. I don't know if it's a good idea to have a sort of official Crates.io namespace, but it's something that we could think about at least. But at the very least, talking to some of the sponsors of the Rust Foundation, some of the members, and talking to them on a personal level and saying there might be a risk that this dependency will not be maintained in the future, or we've heard that this maintainer might go away or might be interested in something else. Even just raising that concern can be beneficial to these organizations.
Okay. Yeah, I think it would be. I think so many places. I mean, obviously, if you're at the top, you don't really know what software packages you're necessarily using unless somehow they get presented to you. But the lower people who are on the lower rings of the, writing the software, etc., they're going to have more of an idea about what's important, right? So, but communicating that up to the top has got to be a tricky thing to do. I'm kind of curious about how you think people can actually tell that to people, saying, "Hey, we need to pay attention to this, or else this is going to happen. We're using this much software." Do you think that there's people who actually do? There's actually a considerable amount of people who are actually doing that right now within their own company. That they're kind of like being like an ambassador to these projects that maybe could be in some kind of danger, or even have the potential to be, and they're trying to rally support to fix this problem.
Yes, I know organizations who do just that right now. They are aware of the risk. They are sometimes even working on tooling and software to uncover that. Um, I guess one of the public ones that we can talk about is Embark with Cargo Deny, which is a tool which has a sort of ignore list or non allow list, which allows you to add things that you don't want to have in your project for one reason or another. It might be a licensing issue, might be a supply chain issue, whatever. I think that's a good first step, but I know of other attempts within organizations that are not public, which go into the same direction. And I think you can start from a cargo toml and transitively list all of the dependencies. And from there, you can maybe evaluate those dependencies to see where's a bigger risk. Because these things usually don't happen overnight. The writing's usually on the wall for a while. For example, you have a dependency that has a single maintainer for the last 2 years, and there have not been any releases, or there has not been a commit in the last 2 years. That would probably raise some eyebrows if you use that knowingly in your application, in your production code. And I'm talking about these things. Now, the hard part is that these measurements, these metrics, KPIs, they are subjective. And there's no way to standardize this. But that doesn't mean that by looking at maybe 20 or 30 heuristics, you could not come up with some sort of verdict, some sort of conclusion that would give you an indicator, a very rough one that is. For example, a red, green, or yellow light saying you can use that in production and we can faithfully say that this will be around in 2 years. Or be careful, there are some signs which might indicate that this will go away in 3 months.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good point. I didn't know anything about these kind of tools. I was just looking at the cargo deny one. It also does a checking on the license of the software, which is quite interesting. I remember quite a few companies happened to me before where I guess they're going to start to release the product finally, and then they start asking us what software licenses does each of these libraries have? Because it's actually compatible with our tool. Like that's nice to see that you can actually start to block things that are maybe not so friendly to your business, right?
Yeah, and you can even go one step further and say, I create a pull request to your repository. It will be flagged automatically because I use a dependency that has an incompatible license. If I add a dependency that is incompatible with what I have, I cannot merge it, or I need to find an explicit way around the check. And I think for companies that is incredibly valuable. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Building the software bill of materials, getting some trend line over time, seeing if you're improving or if your quality is degrading. Just staying on top of the changelog is a full-time job. Just knowing whether there are any breaking changes in the next major version that you might be affected by. I know that Predrag, for example, is working on Trustfall, which is a Semver-based check, which allows you to see whether your changes would mean a breaking change in your code. Just propagating that up to the application creator, to someone that uses your tool as a dependency, is such a valuable signal. Just having that in one pull request or just having that in one issue is so helpful. It's similar to how Renovate bot fixed some of the dependency issues we had. I would not personally start a production level application without a dependency manager like Dependabot or Renovate in 2024. That would be out of the equation because staying on top of dependencies is another full-time job. Why would I have to do that manually?
Yeah, that's a good point too. But staying on top of dependencies, I mean, that's another question: is why do you need to update all the time? For me, I just always check like every time I work on a project. The first thing I do is I check to see can I actually update anything. Usually things don't break, but recently things have actually been breaking for me, which kind of makes me start to wonder: should I really be upgrading so much? And I know of a specific project that I'm working a lot with. I'm not going to name the project, not to shame them or anything, but because I don't think it's important. What I think is important to talk about is that this is kind of, I see it as a one man band kind of working. Of course, he has some other maintainers, but mostly it's himself. And he's constantly like every day, he's kicking out like 3 to 6 patch releases a day, something like that, because he's always adding features or whatever. There's quite a lot of churn. I mean, he has a huge test suite. So then the question is like, do I even need to always be upgrading? I mean, and I know when I do report a bug, he usually fixes it within a day. Because I'm in Hong Kong, he's in US, so it takes about a day to for everything to churn through. But did that's another question I have too: is do I really need to always upgrade? Because it seems like there's not a crazy amount of stuff that's really changing. It's always like corner cases that he's adding things in, etc. So is it actually important to even start upgrading your dependencies? Do you really need that? It's kind of like another discussion.
It's a fair point, and I share that pain. It's just that if you need to upgrade in the future and you're lagging behind a few versions, it might be that you couldn't. Say a traditional reason for upgrading a dependency is a security issue that got fixed. And I think everyone agrees that patching a security hole is a good idea, especially in the Rust community. So that should be done more or less automatically, or it should at least be raised and then fixed. But what if you don't fix a security issue in a new release? Would you then upgrade? Well, maybe not, because you don't need the feature. Now, it might happen that a couple releases down the road, they find a security issue and fix it, but they don't backport that security fix to older versions. And now you're stuck because on one hand, you need to upgrade to patch the security flaw. On the other side, you're behind a few versions. That means you first need to go through that rite of passage, I guess, where you fix your API calls to that dependency just to be up to date, just in order to fix the security issue. And this is the threat that a lot of people forget about. The other thing is when you have an application that you want to maintain for a long time, say, years instead of months, then standing still is not an option, because even if your code is fine and robust and reliable, it doesn't mean that the world around you doesn't change. There are always changes in critical pieces of your dependencies. Your cloud provider changes, your database changes, and they patch security updates, so they move on. So eventually you are lagging behind, and then you have to decide whether you want to maintain your own fork or you go through the trouble of updating to the latest versions, which might even be one or two major versions into the future. I had a similar problem with Next.js. I'm not in the JavaScript community, but I maintain a small website that is built on Next. And I was on Next 12. They forced me to upgrade to Next 14, and I think Next 15 is out. And it was super painful to do that because I was a bit behind. I did that as a side project, as a hobby project. And I wished I stayed on top of this, because when I needed to upgrade, because I actually wanted a new feature, in this case it was not a security issue but a feature, then I needed to jump through a lot of hoops in order to get there. So I would say it's a bit like eating your vegetables. In the long run it will pay off, and so if we have to do it anyway, then we might as well just use some dependency bot.
The only other thing I have to say about this one is, of course, we need the maintainers to really work with their users if they want them to upgrade. There's definitely a trend happening nowadays where people actually really think about it like, okay, we need to make a change, but I want to make this change least amount of painful as I can for my users, and that is completely fair. And I really appreciate that. Like you said, your change, like that one is really annoying, and I'm sure that definitely avoided you from doing it any sooner until the very last second. Like, I remember talking with Matt's, I forgot his last name. And that's his short name or whatever. But the creator of Ruby, before Ruby 3 came out, I met him in Taiwan. I sat down with him and we were talking about, like Ruby 3 and his concerns about, there's gonna be some changes and it's gonna suck for some people, but we're gonna give you all these benefits. And he brought this up because he was talking about, like, obviously people always, talk about Python versus Ruby. And he talked about, like, did you look at Python? Look at when Python went to 3.0. Basically, nobody wanted to move because it was a huge change. And the output you got from the change wasn't enough to make people really want to have to change. I mean, I think finally Python 2 died, what, 5 years ago? I mean, there was like a 15-year maintenance gap. It was insane.
Yeah, imagine the amount of churn that puts on the maintainers. And I've been there back in the day when we needed to do the Python upgrade. And it wasn't a nice upgrade because you got kind of forced to do it. Contrast that with PHP 5 to 7. It was a similarly big update, but what you got is a huge performance boost. I'm talking 2x performance. And to companies, that translates to money. And that's the language they speak. If you can have twice the compute for the same amount of money, then they are in and they will put everyone behind this. But with Python, it wasn't that easy. The way to justify that was, well, if we don't do it, then we will lag behind. And it was a very vague way of describing the issue. And for an organization that they always hate disruption, they hate if someone cuts into their line of business. They don't want that disruption. For them, it's a cost factor. And if you only can say, oh yeah, Python 3 has better Unicode support, or it supports Unicode by default. And by the way, they also cleaned up some of the older dependencies. They don't see the value of it. So I also value projects like Rust or Linux that have a stable ABI, I guess. So what they put out, what the user-facing APIs look like, they don't change that much. You can rely on them being the same and being stable. And I have huge respect for every library maintainer that makes my life easier and understands that. Yeah, it might be true that if you change the wording slightly, it probably aligns better with the rest of your functions. Or, yeah, if this parameter is optional, then that's probably not a problem. But if you add a new parameter, you make a breaking change, maybe the API is nicer to look at or nicer to use. I don't really care. I write it once and I want to solve a business problem with it. And if you've been to the other side, you can see how disruptive this is if people don't follow that guideline.
Yeah, okay. That it's interesting to hear that. I didn't know. I mean, I haven't really been too much PHP, but that really makes a lot of sense. You know, get 2x out of it, and if you're spending a lot on compute, then 2x performance, right, is a nice thing. It's probably actually could be worth it more than the cost of paying people just to work on doing the upgrade, right? Over time, it's probably how they have to look at it.
And by the way, did you ever realize that there was no PHP 6? And that's because PHP tried the same like Python, where they wanted to introduce Unicode support. I think actually UTF-8 support in PHP 6, but no one got behind it because there was no business value in it. There was no point from a business side. So that failed. There were books which were printed on PHP 6, and PHP 6 never got released. So they skipped that version, ditched that project entirely, went to PHP 7. It's still ASCII based. And Python tried the same. And when I saw that, I realized that they made a major mistake. And it would have been, it has been a very, very ongoing project. Glad that's behind us.
I still find it quite interesting about being so late in the game and not having UTF-8 support out of the box. It just seems insane. Very few reasons about why you would not do that. I mean, in fact, there's basically none at this point, considering we're kind of a global society. Is the main one to look for?
Totally, but you have to remember that you can use UTF-8 in PHP and it works just fine. It's just not a guarantee that, or it's not a restriction by the programming language itself. Everything inside PHP, all the code that you write is ASCII, and all the file input and output is also ASCII. But if you want to be explicit about it, you can always check if something is valid UTF-8. And on a day to day, you don't even think about it too much. I think actually, from what I can tell, it was a sensical decision from PHP to not go forward with it, because as I said, it would have been a major disruption, and they even tried. So there's proof that they failed and chose another path.
Well, I just remember this with Python, right? Python 2, I think the default strings are ASCII, and I think with 3, I think they decided to make a default UTF-8, if I remember correctly. Yeah, because the reason I remember this is because I was working in Shanghai in OpenERP, which is a Python-based ERP system, and I just thought that was bonkers. Like, oh my god, like how are we going to be able to really handle this stuff? Because most people are doing business and they're writing stuff in ASCII characters using English, but of course, if in mainland China, that the English usually they're using in Chinese, at least in the factory and stuff. So it was just such like a problem for us to work on the system because of that.
Yeah, there was a linter or fixer that would upgrade your code from Python 2 to Python 3. But the thing they couldn't fix for you were string operations. Or at least that was very hard to do because maybe you had a reason for checking the length of a string and you would expect the number of characters, but it depends on what you define as a character, right? You in Unicode you can have characters that are 2 bytes long, but nothing prevents you from, for example, counting either the characters or counting the bytes. Maybe you want to count the Unicode code points or the runes or whatever else metric you have, but a fixer or a linter cannot decide that for you. You might have a valid use case for it. So all of these applications, they needed to be audited in order to check what actually was the purpose of that. So it wasn't an easy change for users.
Now you're starting to remind me of the issues of encoding with these multi-character. emojis now, if you know what I'm talking about. I don't know if people at home know this, but I ran into this recently. I was using this app, and it has a chat component to it, and there's a web browser where you can type into it. And so, because usually I'm at my computer when I'm most of the time because I'm a typical programmer, right? So usually I throw it up on the web browser, and then I reply with that. And I got really weird characters one time, and I was like, "What is this? Why did they send me a square and something else?" It was some colored square, and I was like, "What does this even mean?" And I had to open up my phone. It's totally different character because some of these emojis are actually like multiple emojis together. Like, if you see like a person, right? It'd be like it'd be like, a skin color would be one, and then the other one is the emoji, and then you put it your phone puts it together, and you have a different emoji, which is kind of interesting. But I think some emojis are like combinations of other emojis or something too, just besides the color and all that.
Yeah. So one time I was trying to type a message to a friend and I wanted to be funny. So I added a line completely filled with bombs, like bomb emojis. And then I wanted it to fit into exactly one line. By accident, I typed in one bomb emoji too much and I wanted to remove it. So I hit backspace and I realized that they replaced it with another of these rectangles. And so I realized that their Unicode handling is also not 100% correct. You could even send it off and then it would kind of split the emoji in between the byte sequence. So emojis are hard.
Or I mean, they're really hard now just because like what we're talking about, like some emojis are just combinations of other emojis, which makes it really complicated about okay, when do I start splitting stuff? I haven't worked a lot with text, but I worked enough that I do realize that there's definitely some wonkiness that you have to kind of run into and work with.
Well, I guess the entire file system and all of computing is full with such foot guns. Um, we work with technology that was more or less invented half a century or a century ago. So some of these RFCs are very, very old. They predate the web, and we inherited that from Unix. And I guess back in the time, all of that made sense, but now we have to deal with all of that legacy. It's not an easy task.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue. Yeah, sorry, we are starting to approach the end of our time, where we're just getting side rails with all the different topics. But I am enjoying it. I think people probably enjoyed hearing our banter, even though it's not really going to anywhere. But yeah, so kind of coming back to kind of what we started talking about, like the lychees part. I mean, I am kind of curious because it seems pretty complete. What kind of features are you adding in now?
The main feature that people always request is recursion support. And the idea is that you take a link, you check, you extract all of the links, and then you check the links that link to other things internally on the same website. And that is a missing feature. So we tried to add that. There were 3 different attempts, but it's very hard to get this right such that it stays maintainable and it kind of fits in elegantly with how we build the rest of the system. Everything is done asynchronously and there are a couple channels. We follow a pattern called structured concurrency, which seems to gain some more following lately. And the idea is that you kind of want to avoid sending futures across function bounds. So you try to handle all of the nitty gritty details of futures within a single function or within a single method. And you spawn a couple async futures essentially, and then you collect the results. You might stream out the results, that's fine, but you essentially don't have to add send and sync bounds everywhere. And I personally think it's very nice to do that. And instead, you can use channels and send the results to someone else who might be interested in the results. And so Lychee is very channel based. And that helped us as well when we added WebAssembly support, which was another thing that people asked us for. We have we have a sort of chain of commands structure where we send a request to multiple hops, and you can build your own request chain. And there's a response chain where you can hook into any of the stages to make any modifications, like changing the host or changing the URL or whatever you want. And so in order to hook in a recursive support, that would require some work in order to do it properly and make it maintainable. So that is one thing that people ask a lot for. And then the usual is just adding more file formats. You can now also run it with a normal browser. That's a recent feature. If you want, you can build a WebAssembly wrapper around Chrome and then use Lychee as a driver for Chrome if you want to build a proxy for that, because that's another thing that people want. They want to execute JavaScript and then check the rendered version of the page. But overall, I would say we're getting closer to being feature complete. And once we reach 1.0, my hope is that we won't need to make as many breaking changes and mostly maintain it and fix bugs. You can also use Lychee as a library, by the way. There's a Python wrapper for it. I think there's also a JavaScript wrapper for it. There's a GitHub action that you can use for your own repo, so you don't even have to touch Lychee, and so on and so on.
Okay, that's pretty cool. There's some pretty cool features in there. I can see how the recursion can be quite complicated to do. So I'm curious at how you're going to solve it. People think it's simple, but I can imagine some cases which would make it quite complicated.
One simple one is, for example, how often do you retry? And another one is, if you get into rate limiting, you need to stop that chain. What about the other requests that are in flight to the same server? So essentially, you need a single host representation or a proxy that keeps track of the number of requests you made to a single host and see how quickly it responded. There's an entire chain of effects that have to be in place for it to work. So it has some ripple effects, but it's not totally impossible to do. It's just time that needs to be invested.
Definitely makes sense. Well, it's good to have you on. It's good to finally meet you and hear more about Lychee. I didn't know so much about it, but I didn't know it's so popular. I'm just not curious if maybe I need to start running this on some projects, but I'll have to take a look at it and think about it. I know I can imagine some places it's definitely important, but for most of my stuff, not at this moment. But it's good to keep in the back of my mind because sometimes I get weird questions. Hey, you're a computer guy. Mate, do you know how something to solve this problem? Maybe, maybe this will come up sometime.
Yeah. Right, give it a try. I personally like Rust based tools. Whenever there's a Rust CLI tool, I want to try it first. It might not have the entire feature set of, let's say, a competing tool, but I find them usually pretty performant and well done. And writing CLI tools with Rust is a joy. So I want to have more of that.
Okay, Matthias, good to have you on. Hopefully, I have you again in the future.
Yeah, thanks for having me.